The autumn wind cut through the Ozark Hills like a blade, carrying the scent of limestone and decay. In the small town of Hartwell, Missouri, population 3,200, the Henderson family had lived for 3 generations, quiet people who kept to themselves and respected the land. But on October 14, 2006, that quietness turned into something darker. Rachel Henderson, 29, her husband David, 32, and their 2 children, Lily, 7, and Noah, 5, vanished without a trace during what was supposed to be a simple afternoon hike through the Mark Twain Cave system, a network of tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the Missouri countryside. The last person to see them was old Vernon Pratt, who ran the general store on Highway 19. He remembered Rachel buying bottled water and trail mix around noon, mentioning they wanted to explore some of the lesser-known passages before the first snow came. Vernon had warned them about going too deep, about how easy it was to lose your way in those caves. But David had laughed it off. He'd grown up in these hills, he said. He knew every rock and crevice. Vernon watched them drive away in their blue Ford pickup, heading east toward the cave entrance on County Road 47. He remembered thinking Rachel looked tired, that maybe they should have postponed the trip, but he didn't say anything. People in Hartwell minded their own business, a trait that seemed quaint until it became tragic. If you're watching this, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We bring you stories like this one every week, stories that deserve to be remembered. By nightfall, when the Hendersons hadn't returned, Rachel's mother, Patricia, called the sheriff. Within hours, search teams assembled, volunteers from 3 counties, cave rescue specialists from St. Louis, tracking dogs that picked up the family's scent at the cave entrance, but lost it 200 yards in where the passages split into a dozen different directions. The dogs circled and whined, confused by the way scent behaved in the constant 54-degree temperature of the caves, the way it pooled in low spots and vanished in others. For 6 weeks, they searched. They found Rachel's red jacket caught on a rock formation near what locals called the Devil's Throat, a vertical shaft that dropped 80 feet into darkness. They found one of Noah's sneakers in a narrow crawl space that required going on your belly to navigate. They found a granola bar wrapper, a hair tie, a crumpled tissue, but they never found the family. The investigation consumed Hartwell. Sheriff Tom Brennan worked 18-hour days, mapping every tunnel, every possible route the Hendersons might have taken. He brought in geological experts who used ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging. They found nothing. The caves were simply too vast, too complex. There were chambers no human had entered in a century, passages that flooded during spring rains and dried into bone-white corridors by summer. Some tunnels were so narrow you had to exhale completely to squeeze through. Others opened into cathedral-sized rooms where your headlamp couldn't reach the ceiling. The prevailing theory became that the family had fallen into an underground river system that fed into the Merrimack River. Their bodies carried miles away and lost forever in the dark water that rushed through limestone arteries beneath Missouri. Patricia Henderson refused to accept it. She moved into Rachel's house on Maple Street, sleeping in her daughter's bed, keeping the children's rooms exactly as they'd left them. Noah's toy trucks lined up on the windowsill, Lily's drawings taped to the walls, the beds made with the superhero sheets they'd picked out together at the Walmart in Rolla. Every morning, she drove to the cave entrance and sat there with a thermos of coffee, waiting. The town initially rallied around her, bringing casseroles, organizing prayer vigils at the Baptist Church on Main Street. But as months turned into years, the sympathy faded into awkward avoidance. People crossed the street when they saw Patricia coming. The Hendersons became a ghost story, whispered about, but never discussed openly, the kind of tragedy that made people uncomfortable because it had no resolution, no body to bury, no closure to mark the end of grief. David's brother, James, left Hartwell entirely. He couldn't stand the weight of the caves looming over the town, couldn't handle the way people looked at him with that mixture of pity and relief that it hadn't been their family swallowed by the earth. He moved to Kansas City, changed his phone number, tried to build a life where October 14th, 2006 was just another day on the calendar. But the guilt followed him. He'd been the one who'd taught David to cave, who'd taken him on his first underground expedition when they were teenagers. He'd shown his brother the beauty of the subterranean world, and that knowledge had killed him. James drank too much for the first 2 years, lost a job, lost an apartment, finally found himself in a support group for families of missing persons where everyone understood that closure was a myth, that you never stopped looking even when the searches ended. But in the spring of 2015, 9 years after the disappearance, a group of experienced cavers from the National Speleological Society arrived in Hartwell. They were conducting a systematic survey of unmapped portions of the Mark Twain system, using new technology that hadn't existed in 2006. Portable LIDAR scanners that could create three-dimensional maps of cave passages in real time, advanced GPS units that could maintain signal even hundreds of feet underground through a network of relay beacons, and high-resolution cameras that could capture details in near-total darkness. The team was led by Dr. Michael Reeves, a geologist from the University of Missouri, who'd spent 2 decades studying Ozark cave formations. He'd published papers on speleogenesis, on the way water carved limestone over millions of years, on the delicate ecosystems that existed in perpetual darkness. But he'd also read about the Henderson disappearance, had followed the original search efforts, and privately believed there were sections of the cave system that had never been properly explored. On April 3rd, the team was working in a section called the Eastern Reaches, an area so remote and difficult to access that it had only been entered twice in recorded history. Once in 1923 by a group of local boys who'd squeezed through passages their adult supervisors couldn't navigate, and again in 1967 by a National Geographic expedition that had spent 3 days mapping what they could reach before declaring the area too dangerous for further exploration. To get there required navigating through a passage locals called the Keyhole, a gap barely 18 inches wide that opened into a chamber the size of a cathedral. Beyond that lay a maze of tunnels that twisted and doubled back on themselves, disorienting even with modern equipment. The rock formations were spectacular, massive columns where stalactites and stalagmites had fused over millennia, flowstone cascades that looked like frozen waterfalls, delicate soda straws hanging from the ceiling like crystal chandeliers. But the beauty came with danger. The floor was uneven, full of pits and crevices that could swallow a person. The ceiling dripped constantly, making everything slick, and the passages branched endlessly, creating a labyrinth where one wrong turn could leave you lost forever. It was Dr. Reeves's assistant, a graduate student named Jennifer Park, who first noticed the anomaly. On her LIDAR scanner, a section of what should have been solid limestone showed a hollow space, a void that didn't match any of the existing maps. She called the team over, and they spent an hour confirming the reading from multiple angles. There was definitely something behind the wall, a chamber, probably natural, about 30 feet in diameter based on the echo patterns. The question was how to reach it. The team spent 3 hours carefully excavating, removing limestone debris that had collapsed at some point, blocking what turned out to be a narrow crawl space. The rocks were loose, suggesting a relatively recent collapse, perhaps within the last few decades, rather than the centuries-old formations around them. When they finally cleared enough space to squeeze through, they emerged into a chamber that took their breath away. The room was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that soared 20 feet overhead. Stalactites hung like frozen chandeliers, and the walls glittered with crystal formations that caught their headlamps and scattered the light into 1,000 tiny stars. The floor was relatively flat, covered with a thin layer of limestone dust that showed no footprints except their own. The air was still, undisturbed, carrying that particular smell of deep caves, mineral and ancient and utterly alien to the world above. But what made Jennifer gasp, what made Dr. Reeves immediately radio the surface for Sheriff Brennan, was what sat in the center of the chamber on a flat shelf of rock that jutted from the wall like a natural bench. A backpack. Blue canvas with yellow trim, the colors faded but recognizable. Beside it, a digital camera in a waterproof case, the kind serious photographers used underground. And scattered around both, like fallen leaves, were personal items that told a story without words. A child's coloring book with pages rippled from moisture, the crayons still visible in their box, a man's leather wallet with credit cards and a driver's license visible through the clear plastic window, a woman's silver bracelet with the name Rachel engraved on the inside in flowing script, a small stuffed elephant that might have been white once, but was now grey with limestone dust. The chamber had been naturally sealed by a rockfall, likely triggered by the family's movement through the unstable passage. The collapse had created an airtight tomb, preserving everything inside with eerie precision. There were no bodies, no bones, nothing to indicate what had happened to the Hendersons after they'd reached this hidden room. But the camera held answers that had been locked in darkness for 9 years. Sheriff Brennan arrived within 2 hours, bringing Patricia Henderson with him despite protocol, suggesting she should wait. He'd made that decision during the 20-minute drive from Hartwell, listening to her plead over the phone, knowing that if positions were reversed, he'd want to see whatever had been found. She was 71 now, her hair completely white, her hands trembling as she climbed down into the cave system with assistance from 2 rescue workers who'd been on the original search team in 2006. When she saw the backpack, she made a sound that wasn't quite a cry, wasn't quite a gasp, something primal and wounded that echoed through the chamber. She held Rachel's bracelet for the first time in 9 years, and her tears fell onto the silver, washing away 9 years of limestone dust. The sheriff carefully retrieved the camera, bagging it as evidence, knowing that whatever images it contained might finally explain what happened in the darkness beneath Hartwell. Back at the station, a technician removed the SD card. The camera had been off when they found it, the battery long dead, but the card was intact. A small miracle of technology, designed to preserve data even in hostile environments. 47 photos, time-stamped from October 14, 2006, between 1:47 p.m. and 4:23 p.m. The final hours of the Henderson family's journey, documented in digital fragments that had waited nearly a decade to be seen. Sheriff Brennan called in a forensic photographer from the state police to help process the images, to look for details that might have been missed by civilian eyes. They worked through the night, printing each photo, arranging them in chronological order on a conference table, studying them under bright lights that seemed harsh after the soft darkness of the caves. The first images showed exactly what you'd expect, a family having an adventure, Rachel smiling at the camera, her headlamp creating a halo effect in the darkness, her face bright with excitement, David pointing at a particularly impressive rock formation, explaining something to Lily and Noah, who stood close together, looking small and excited in their matching blue jackets that Rachel had bought specifically for the trip. The caves were beautiful in those early photos, mysterious and inviting, the kind of place that made you understand why people explored the unknown. Photo 5 showed them having a snack break, sitting on smooth rocks while they ate granola bars and drank water from their bottles. Photo 8 captured Noah's delight at finding a tiny cave cricket, his finger pointing at the pale insect, while Lily leaned in to look. These were the images of a normal family outing, the kind of photos that filled albums and holiday cards, evidence of time spent together in a world that suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. Photo 12 showed them at what must have been a decision point. Multiple passages branching off in different directions. David was checking a paper map, frowning slightly, his headlamp illuminating the creased paper while Rachel looked over his shoulder. The timestamp read 2:14 p.m. They'd been underground for over 2 hours, longer than they'd probably intended. In the background, you could see Lily holding Noah's hand, both children looking tired but still trusting. This was the moment, Sheriff Brennan would later realize, where everything changed. This was where David made the choice that would determine their fate, which passage to take, which path to follow into the darkness. Photos 13 through 23 documented their descent into deeper passages. The formations grew more dramatic, more alien, massive columns of flowstone that looked like melted wax, pools of water so clear they reflected the cave ceiling like mirrors, passages so narrow the camera had to be held at arm's length to capture them. In photo 19, Noah was drinking from one of those pools, cupping the water in his small hands while Rachel watched, her expression protective. Cave water was usually safe, filtered through layers of limestone, but the image would haunt Patricia for the rest of her life. The innocence of it, the trust that everything would be fine, the way Rachel's hand hovered near Noah's shoulder, ready to catch him if he slipped. Photo 21 showed David helping Lily climb over a particularly large boulder, his hands supporting her weight while she reached for a handhold above. Photo 23 showed all 4 of them in a group photo, taken with the camera's timer, smiling despite their obvious exhaustion, a family still together, still confident they'd find their way out. Photo 24 showed the first sign of trouble. The image was blurred, as if taken in haste or with shaking hands, but you could make out David's face, no longer calm, his eyes wide as he looked at something off-camera. The timestamp jumped forward almost an hour, 3:52 p.m. Whatever had happened in that missing time, they hadn't stopped to document it. An hour of searching, of backtracking, of realizing they might be lost. The forensic photographer noted that the camera's settings had changed. The ISO had been bumped up, suggesting lower light conditions, that their headlamps might have been failing. Modern LED headlamps could last 8 to 10 hours, but cheaper models, the kind a casual caver might buy, could die in 3 or 4. The next series of photos were darker, taken with flash in what appeared to be an increasingly desperate situation. Photo 27 showed the family squeezed into a narrow passage, their faces pressed against cold stone, David in front trying to force his way through, while Rachel and the children waited behind. The passage looked impossibly tight, the kind of space that could trigger panic even in experienced cavers. Photo 30 showed David at what looked like a dead end, his hands against solid rock, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The children weren't visible in that shot, but you could see Rachel in the background, holding them close, her face turned away from the camera. Photo 32 showed them resting, sitting against a wall, while their remaining lights cast long shadows. Noah appeared to be crying, his face buried against Rachel's shoulder. Lily stared at the camera with an expression too mature for a 7-year-old, an expression that understood more than she should have had to. Photos 31 through 40 showed their discovery of the sealed chamber. The images captured their entry through what must have been the crawl space Jennifer Park would rediscover 9 years later. There was relief in those photos, captured in the way Rachel sat down heavily on the rock shelf, the way the children curled up together, exhausted from hours of navigating through darkness and fear. David had found a secondary passage leading out. Photo 36 showed him at the entrance to it, his headlamp illuminating a tunnel that disappeared into darkness, his body language suggesting hope, that maybe this was finally the exit they'd been searching for. Photo 37 showed Rachel unpacking their remaining supplies, 2 water bottles, some granola bars, the coloring book and crayons she'd brought to keep the kids occupied during rest breaks. She was trying to create normalcy, trying to convince Lily and Noah that everything would be okay, that Daddy would find the way out, and they'd be home for dinner. But photo 37 changed everything. The flash illuminated what David had seen in that tunnel, not an exit, but a vertical shaft, a pit that dropped away into nothing. The angle suggested he'd nearly walked into it, had caught himself at the last second, his hands gripping the edge while his body tilted forward. The passage was a dead end, and worse, a trap that could have killed him instantly if he'd taken one more step. The limestone around the pit's edge was smooth, worn by water, offering no purchase for climbing back up if you fell. Photo 38 captured his return to the chamber, and even in the harsh flashlighting, you could see the defeat in his posture, the way he'd aged in the span of minutes. Photos 38 through 45 documented their attempts to backtrack, to find the crawl space they'd come through. But the rockfall must have already begun, perhaps triggered by their passage, perhaps by natural settling of the unstable formation. Photo 43 showed dust in the air, caught in the flash like snow, particles of limestone suspended in the still air of the chamber. Photo 44 showed a pile of limestone debris where there had been an opening, rocks ranging from pebble-sized to boulder-sized, completely blocking the narrow crawl space that had been their entry point. David's hands were visible in the frame, reaching toward the collapse, and the forensic photographer noted scratches and cuts on his fingers, evidence that he'd tried to dig through, tried to move rocks that probably weighed hundreds of pounds each. Photo 45 was just blackness, taken as the last of their headlamp batteries died, leaving them with only the camera's flash to illuminate their prison. The final two photos were taken with the camera's flash alone, probably hours apart, based on the battery usage patterns. Photo 46 showed the family huddled together on the rock shelf, creating a tight circle of warmth. Their faces were turned toward each other, not the camera. David had his arms around all of them, Rachel's head on his shoulder, the children pressed between their parents like bookends holding them together. They were conserving heat, conserving energy, waiting in the darkness for rescue that would never come. The timestamp read 4:17 p.m. They'd been in the chamber for at least 25 minutes, maybe longer. The temperature in the caves remained a constant 54 degrees year-round, cool enough to cause hypothermia over time, especially in children, especially when combined with fear and exhaustion and the dampness that permeated everything underground. Photo 47, the last image ever captured by the Henderson family, showed just the rock wall. But if you looked carefully, if you enhanced the image the way the FBI lab did 3 days later using software that could pull details from shadows and grain, you could see scratches in the limestone, numbers carved with something sharp. 10/14/06. A date. And 4 words carved with a belt buckle or a pocket knife, letters barely a quarter-inch tall, painstakingly etched into stone that had existed for millions of years. We loved being together. Below that, smaller, almost invisible. Tell Mom, we're sorry. The question that consumed everyone, Sheriff Brennan, Patricia, the cave rescue team, the FBI investigators who descended on Hartwell, the geological experts who studied the chamber's formation, the news media who turned the story into a national sensation for 2 weeks, was simple and impossible. Where were the bodies? The sealed chamber showed no other exits beyond the collapsed crawl space and the deadly vertical shaft. The vertical shaft in the side passage dropped into a water-filled sump that divers explored, finding nothing but limestone walls and a current that led deeper into unexplored sections of the cave system. The rockfall that sealed the entrance was examined and found to have been relatively minor, not the catastrophic collapse that would be needed to completely bury 4 people. The rocks were loose, easily moved by the rescue team, revealing the crawl space beyond still intact. The family had simply vanished from a sealed room, leaving behind their possessions like shed skins, like evidence of a magic trick where the magician never revealed the secret. Dr. Reeves spent months studying the chamber, bringing in specialists in cave geology, hydrology, and even forensic taphonomy, the science of what happens to bodies after death. His theory, eventually published in the Journal of Cave and Karst Studies and later picked up by National Geographic and Scientific American, proposed that the Henderson family had discovered a crack in the chamber floor, hidden beneath a shallow pool of water that had since evaporated or drained away. In their desperate search for an exit after the rockfall sealed the entrance and the vertical shaft proved impassable, they might have entered it, possibly one at a time, believing it led to another passage, to safety, to the surface. The crack could have opened into a subterranean river system, one of the many underwater channels that connected the caves to the Merrimack River basin. These water passages could be narrow, winding, filled with siphons where the ceiling dipped below the waterline. If they'd gone in without diving equipment, without knowledge of what lay ahead, they wouldn't have come out. The current would have carried them miles through flooded tunnels before depositing them in an underground lake or chamber where they'd never be found, where the water and the darkness would keep them forever. It was the only explanation that fit the evidence, Reeves argued in his paper. The family had walked into the water and never walked out. But even he admitted the theory had problems. Why would they leave their possessions behind? Why would David carve a message if they thought they'd found an escape route? Why did the photos show no evidence of this water crack? No indication they'd found another possible exit. But Patricia Henderson didn't believe it. She'd studied those 47 photos until she could see them with her eyes closed, could recite the timestamp of each one, could describe every detail of her daughter's face in the flickering flash. She'd held her daughter's bracelet, had touched the coloring book that still showed Lily's careful work, a rainbow colored in crayon, the lines mostly staying inside the boundaries, a sun in the corner with a smiling face. She'd read Noah's name written in Rachel's handwriting on the inside cover, and she'd read those final 4 words carved into stone 100 times, feeling their weight, understanding what they meant. They didn't panic, she told Sheriff Brennan 6 months after the discovery. They were sitting in his office, the case file spread across his desk like an autopsy report, photos and geological surveys and witness statements creating a paper trail that led nowhere. Look at that last photo. Look at how they're holding each other. People who are about to try swimming through an underwater passage don't stop to carve messages. They don't arrange themselves for a photo. They were saying goodbye. They knew. David and Rachel, they knew they weren't getting out, and they made a choice to spend their last hours together as a family, holding each other in the dark. Brennan didn't argue. He'd spent enough years on this case to know that some mysteries don't get solved. They just get documented. The sealed chamber became part of the official record, a place where the Henderson family had been, had lived their final hours, had left evidence of their existence. But where they'd gone, what had happened in those last moments after the camera's battery finally died, remained as dark and unknowable as the caves themselves. The chamber was permanently sealed by order of the county, the entrance marked with a bronze plaque that bore the names of Rachel, David, Lily, and Noah Henderson, along with their dates of birth and the single date they shared, October 14th, 2006. Patricia attended the ceremony, standing in the cave with a group of cavers and officials and media representatives, listening as a minister said words about mystery and faith and the unknowable depths of the earth. When it was over, when everyone else had returned to the surface, she placed her hand on the cool limestone and whispered something no one else could hear. Words meant only for her daughter, for the grandchildren she'd never watched grow up, for the son-in-law who'd made a mistake that cost everything. She stayed there for an hour, alone in the darkness except for her headlamp, until Sheriff Brennan came back down to check on her. She let him lead her out, but she never stopped looking back, James Henderson came back to Hartwell for the first time in 9 years. He met Patricia at Rachel's house, now his house technically, though it still felt like walking into a museum of someone else's life. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the family had eaten breakfast on October 14th, 2006. David making pancakes while Rachel helped the kids with their shoes, everyone excited for the cave adventure, and looked at prints of the 47 photos spread between them like tarot cards, predicting a fate already lived. "I've been angry," James said, his voice rough from years of not talking about this, of pushing it down, of pretending he could forget. Angry at David for taking them in there. Angry at the caves for swallowing them. Angry at God for letting it happen. Angry at myself for teaching him to love those goddamn holes in the ground. I showed him his first cave when he was 12. Took him to Merrimack Caverns, the tourist one with the lights and the guided tours. He was fascinated, couldn't stop talking about it. For his next 3 birthdays, all he wanted was caving equipment, headlamps, rope, carabiners. I created this. I made him into someone who thought the caves were safe, who thought he could handle anything underground. Patricia picked up photo 46, the one showing the family in their final huddle, their faces turned toward each other in the darkness. "They had 3 more hours together than we knew about," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. 3 hours in that chamber. Maybe longer. We don't know when the camera died. David and Rachel, they would have told the kids stories, made them laugh, kept them warm, sang songs probably. Rachel loved to sing. They would have been a family until the very end, and that's what they chose. When the chamber sealed, when David found that pit instead of an exit, they could have panicked, they could have screamed and fought and died afraid. But look at these photos. They took the time to document everything. They made sure we'd know they'd been there. They carved that message. They held each other. That's not fear, James. That's love. "We don't know it was the end," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. He wanted to believe in the water passage theory, wanted to imagine his brother finding a way out, even if that way led to drowning rather than suffocation. Maybe they found something after the camera died. Maybe there's another passage we haven't discovered yet. "I do," Patricia replied. She touched the image of her daughter's face, frozen in pixels and time, forever 29, forever a mother of young children, forever lost in the darkness beneath Missouri. "I know my Rachel. She wouldn't have tried that water passage with the kids. She wouldn't have risked them drowning. She was terrified of water, almost drowned as a child at a pool party, never learned to swim properly. Whatever happened, they stayed together. And I think they went to sleep. I think David and Rachel made sure the kids were comfortable, told them they were just resting until morning, and they all went to sleep in each other's arms. The temperature would have done the rest. Hypothermia is gentle, they say, like falling asleep. No pain, just cold, then sleep, then nothing. Then, the official investigation closed in December 2015, exactly 9 years and 2 months after the Henderson family walked into the Mark Twain Cave system, carrying water bottles and granola bars and a camera that would preserve their final hours. The final report ran to 300 pages, documenting every search, every theory, every piece of evidence recovered from the sealed chamber, every geological survey and forensic analysis and witness interview. The conclusion was simple, bureaucratic, maddeningly incomplete. The Henderson family died in the Mark Twain Cave system on or around October 14, 2006, likely due to a combination of disorientation, equipment failure, and environmental factors, including hypothermia. The exact cause and location of death remain undetermined. The case is hereby closed pending discovery of new evidence. For Hartwell, the closure of the case brought a strange kind of peace. The ghost story became history, something that had happened rather than something that was still happening, a tragedy with documentation, if not resolution. The cave entrance was fenced and gated, marked with warning signs that detailed the dangers of unauthorized exploration. Tour groups could still visit the main passages, the safe, well-lit, commercially developed sections where guides told sanitized versions of the Henderson story. But the deeper sections, the places where the Henderson family had gone, were declared off-limits in perpetuity. The county installed motion sensor cameras at the gate, more to deter curiosity seekers than actual explorers. But every few months, someone would try to break in, drawn by the mystery, by the desire to see where the photos had been taken, to stand in the chamber where 4 people had spent their final hours. Patricia Henderson lived another 3 years, dying quietly in her sleep in February 2018 at the age of 74. She left instructions for her burial, next to her husband in the Hartwell cemetery, with a headstone that bore not just her name, but her daughter's family as well. The inscription read, Patricia May Henderson, 1943-2018, together with Rachel, David, Lily and Noah in memory and love. The funeral drew a surprising crowd, people from the original search teams, journalists who'd covered the story, cavers from across the country who'd been moved by the 47 photos. James Henderson gave a eulogy that talked about persistence, about a woman who'd refused to stop looking even when everyone else had given up, about love that transcended death and darkness and sealed stone chambers. He broke down halfway through and couldn't finish. The minister completed it for him. James kept the house on Maple Street but couldn't bring himself to live there. The rooms held too many ghosts, too many reminders of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday parties that would never happen again. He rented it to a young couple from Springfield who knew nothing about the Hendersons, who painted the walls cheerful colors and replaced the old carpet and filled the rooms with their own memories and their own children's laughter. But in the basement, in a locked cabinet that the renters never saw, James kept the original items recovered from the chamber: the backpack with its faded canvas, the coloring book with its rippled pages, the camera that had documented everything. The photos themselves were stored digitally now, backed up in 3 separate locations, preserved for a future when maybe someone would find another clue, another piece of the puzzle, another chapter to a story everyone thought had ended. Doctor. Reeves never published another paper about the Hendersons. He'd said everything he could say scientifically, had explored every rational explanation, had presented his theory to peer review and public scrutiny. But late at night, in his office at the University of Missouri, surrounded by geological maps and core samples and photographs of cave formations, he'd sometimes pull up the photos on his computer and study them, looking for something he'd missed, some detail that would explain the impossible disappearance. He never found it. The images remained exactly what they'd always been: a record of a family's last afternoon together, 47 frozen moments in the darkness beneath Missouri, evidence without explanation, documentation without resolution. The caves themselves continued, indifferent to human tragedy, following the same patterns they'd followed for millions of years. Water dripped from limestone ceilings, carving new passages with infinite patience, one drop at a time reshaping stone. Crystals grew, millimeter by millimeter, adding to formations that had existed since before humans walked the earth. In the sealed chamber, where the Henderson family had spent their final hours, the rock shelf where they'd sat slowly accumulated a thin layer of mineral deposits, covering the scratches on the wall, obscuring the words they'd left behind. In another 100 years, the message would be completely hidden, readable only with specialized equipment, a secret kept by stone and time and darkness. But on October 14th each year, cavers from across the country make a pilgrimage to Hartwell. They gather at the bronze plaque, sharing stories about cave safety, about the importance of proper equipment and training, about never taking the underground for granted, about the need to tell someone on the surface where you're going and when you expect to return. And some of them, the ones who've read the reports and seen the photos and felt the weight of the story, will place their hands on the sealed entrance and imagine a family inside. Imagine them telling stories in the dark. Imagine them holding each other as their lights went out one by one. Imagine them falling asleep together in the cold and the silence and the absolute darkness that exists nowhere else on Earth. Because that's what the 47 photos ultimately revealed. Not how the Hendersons died, but how they lived in those final hours. They stayed together. They documented their journey so someone would know they'd been there, would understand what happened, would see that they hadn't given up, but had instead chosen to face the end as a family rather than as individuals. They carved a message into stone that would outlast their bodies, wherever those bodies might be. They loved being together, even at the end, especially at the end. And that choice, documented in digital images and scratched into limestone, became their legacy, more powerful than any explanation of what happened after the last photo.